What up, hipsters? Monseezy here, Intangible Roots. Excuse me. And here to talk a little bit about some things, going to break something down. And so, what we going to talk about? Today, I'm going to dive into something that has been bothering me, probably bothering all of us, most likely the whole dance world. I'm sure a lot of people got thoughts and conversations around this. What am I talking about? I am talking about the label commercial dance and why commercial dance is not a form of dance. And while we're at it, I think I'm gonna break down some myths around, other labels like commercial jazz and commercial hip hop and street jazz and jazz funk and studio hip hop and like all these crazy labels, right? Even street dance. I might have to break that down a little bit too. So let's start with this. Let's start with the word or the phrase commercial, right? Commercial is not a genre of dance, right? It's not a technique. It's not a cultural practice, right? It's an industry label. So it describes, right, the context which with something is being performed or packaged, right? Think music videos, think tours, think commercials themselves, right? So award shows that we just had BET Awards, right? These are commercial entities or represented as or labeled commercial entities, right? So commercial refers to, or let me say that it refers to how dance is used, right? Not what dance actually is. So saying something is commercial dance is like saying commercial food is a cuisine. It's not. It just tells you where it's being sold, right? So a hip hop routine on stage or behind a pop star or in a commercial, whatever it is, it's hip hop. It's either hip hop or it's not, right? Just because it's used in a commercial context, it's either hip hop or it's not. So why is that a problem? Okay, so here's some thoughts on that, right? One of the reasons I think this could be a problem because when people start calling a style or a form of dance commercial, right, we sort of erase the form's roots, the techniques, the community, right? We create this sort of vague aesthetic that builds more on, the vibes or the fashion than it actually does the knowledge of the form, right? More importantly, it erases the people, it erases the culture, it erases the bloodline, especially when it comes to Black American forms like hip hop, like jazz, or just the things of the Africanist presence or lineage, right? Think about this. When someone says commercial jazz, they're usually not talking about, vernacular jazz or authentic jazz, which is I shouldn't have to like the word jazz should not have to be encumbered by such language as authentic or vernacular. It jazz dancing is the true jazz dancing. That's not to be confused with the commercial, the label commercial. That's not jazz dancing at all. That's good dancing, but that ain't jazz dancing. That is inspired by jazz. Let's be very clear about this. That's inspired by jazz, but those are stylings, and those are stylings. I'll do a whole jazz thing later, but those are stylings of particular people. We'll talk about that in another time, right? So again, to encumber the word jazz authentic, we shouldn't have to do that. Or either if you're talking about like Black American theatrical jazz, we can really get into that, and I'll get into that during the jazz segment. So there are often people are often talking about like this mix of ballet lines or modern isolations or maybe tricks or shoot, in some cases even things I might see on TikTok. But it doesn't reflect the vocabulary or the rhythm, the science, the grooves, the social context of the Africanist principles that we see in jazz, right? And if it doesn't have that, it's not jazz. It's choreography. It can be inspired by jazz. Doesn't mean it's bad dancing. It can be great dancing, but authentic, questionable. But that again, it's not the same thing as saying jazz dance is a completely other thing when you start adding these labels to it. So let's talk about jazz funk and street jazz, right? Now, let's break this word down. Jazz funk. What is it? Right? What is this thing called jazz funk? And why are these classes labeled jazz funk or even street jazz, right? So funk is a genre of music. We know this. It's rooted in Black expression. Jazz is a form of dance with its own trajectory. Separate from that, funk came later. If not talking about the etymology of the word that comes before, but in terms of these music and dance forms. All right. So what people call jazz funk today often is it just means the stylized what I was saying before. It's just a stylized versions of these, famous choreographers with maybe they add a bounce to it, or maybe they add some sass, and we'll talk about bounce and sass when I do the jazz section, right? But this fusion sort of makes no sense culturally. Like you're sort of borrowing the surface aesthetics of funk and jazz, but not the depth or the technique of the groove, or the purpose, right? So let's be clear, jazz funk fusion is a label in a music style, right? This is you can read this in Ricky Vincent's 1996 book Funk, the Music, the People, and the Rhythm of the One. Amazing book if you're into funk music. Vincent is an amazing scholar and well researched. He actually appears in a few different documentaries. But according to Vincent, the jazz and funk were like used to or in a deliberate effort to define the music and stylings of this raw energy, this earthy, non-white music form in the 70s. In simple terms, um, what we're hearing is traditional jazz musicians who incorporated funk rhythms into their technical jazz licks. Talking about musicians like Herbie Hancock with his Headhunters group, whose their jazz funk sound sort of took over in 1974. You have a lot of other groups like the Crusaders or Donald Byrd and his Birdlands. You have James Morrison, you got Lonnie Liston, you have George Duke, you got Sun Ra, you got Ramsey Lewis, Roy Ayers, Grover Washington. And this is not the music, these are not the artists that are being played in these so-called jazz funk classes. But this is the music. And no, while the music may have been, labeled through Billboard as jazz funk and jazz funk fusion in the mid 70s, no new dance came out that was like, oh, this is jazz funk dancing. So again, this is a label that has been constructed by people in order to sell, right? You're thinking about branding, which is all it is, but you're not really learning about the musical genre. And half the time, these classes they're not even dancing to actual jazz funk fusion music. It is just a labeling for these classes, right? And so then you got the term street jazz. Again, confusing. Jazz wasn't born in the street. It was born in the black social clubs, born in the ballrooms and the rent parties and regular other clubs and theaters, not the literal street. But the label makes it sound like, jazz comes from this sort of breaking hip hop kind of a quote unquote street thing, which I still, y'all know me, I still grapple with the word street. I understand it, but I grapple with the use because, and I'll talk about that in a second, it's just I find it dismissive. And so it's sort of like these labels, they sort of strip the form from its lineage. Calling something street jazz is like renaming a person without knowing their name, right? And we do that, if we don't know where somebody's from, we don't know their name, and we know they're from, you know, wherever, whatever city they might be from, we might name them after the city. What up, Jersey? Stuff like that. But in this aspect, I think it stings slightly differently because we're talking about practices that are particular to a culture or community of people and how we sort of highlight what this information is and who these people are and what comes out of these communities, right? It's again, it's sort of disrespect disguised as branding, and I think this is the issue that people are just thinking about the branding of it all. So now we get into another loaded term, street dance, right? It sounds descriptive, but in actuality, it's misleading. I think it's misleading. Whether it's hip hop, house, locking, popping, right? These did not emerge from the street in the literal sense. They came again from Black and Latino communities. You're talking about the who are people who are using spaces like parks and clubs, garages, community centers, as stages of innovation. But calling them street dance collapses sort of a whole history into the vagueness of this urban fantasy, right? It makes it easier to sort of disconnect the form from the people who birthed it. And I think this adds to the complication of a globalized understanding of what hip hop dance is, because everybody's got their foot in the circle and trying to claim. And, while there is space for that conversation, it's a difficult one to have. So the same with studio hip hop, right? The term usually refers to choreography, right? It looks at hip hop, but is taught in a studio, and taught is like taught in a studio setting. It's little to no relationship to hip hop culture or the history or the music even. They're picking whatever kind of music to do this thing too, but many times it's based in poems, right? The formation of poems, POMS, which is cheerleading, right? When you look at like something like Hip Hop International, there's almost no difference from what you see in Hip Hop International that you see in the sort of the championship cheerleading competitions. You're talking about the formation from the circle to the square to the rectangular to somebody getting tossed up in the air or doing whatever it is. That's all from cheerleading, right? So they're just now trying to incorporate more. The focus becomes, locking, but it's formulated through the lens of poems, but with some locking in it or some hip hop or some, whatever thing that they're trying to put together. So you get this formations are used, and it's kind of a modern so-called jazz stylings, right? Sometimes it borrows from those named jazz dancers who are considered to be the jazz greats. But again, this is just stylings, and it's labeled it's labeled jazz or hip hop, but it's not, right? And if it doesn't move, if you're not talking about the groove, if we're not talking about how it reflects on the cipher, if you're not talking about the freestyle, if you're talking about foundations and rhythms, the integrity of it all, then it's simply not hip hop dance. You can see this when you look at my documentary, Everything Remains Raw, which is on my website. You can see the section that talks about, this sort of hybrid form, if you will, this mashup of different forms and styles that's being labeled hip hop, but it's just simply not hip hop. It doesn't make it bad dancing. It's still good dancing, but these labels are confusing because people are thinking, well, I'm learning this. No, you're not learning that. They're just using that as a label to get you in here. That's not the thing that you're actually learning. Again, why does this type of language matter? It matters. So, like, while I'm saying all of this, right, because language like shapes our understanding, you learn, well, if if you learn a dance form without knowing what it is, right, where it came from, or who made it, you're not learning the form. You're learning a product, right? And products can be sold, watered down, repackaged, and made trendy. But the real forms, right, have depth, they have technique, they have community, they have code. And we're not saying that commercial dancers or that I think that's even a misnomer. We're not saying dancers who work in the commercial field don't work hard. Of course they do. That is a really difficult job, and you got to be on a serious A game to stay in that lane. We're also not saying that the choreography that is being used in this sort of setting doesn't require skill. Of course, it requires skill. I'm just saying, don't mistake the setting for the source, right? Don't mistake the setting for the source. That's all I'm saying. So if you care about the dance, if you care about the names, you want to learn the history, you want to say what it is, and you want to study the people who created it. I don't care, if it's jazz, say jazz. If it's hip hop, say it's hip hop. If it's locking, it's locking. If it's juking, it's juking. If it's footwork, it's footwork. Whatever the thing is, say what it is. If it's a mashup, call it a mashup. Maybe you'll call it choreography, but choreography just means placement. If I arrange some artwork on the wall, that's choreography. Runway models walking down the thing and stop, turn, that's choreography. Car chase scenes in movies, that's choreography, right? So if it's this mashup, then just say it's a mashup. It's my idea, my stylings. You can be your personal stylings, right? Whatever influences you to make the thing. But to label it what it's not, that becomes the problem, especially when we're trying to keep the integrity of a dance, if it matters to you. But don't rename the form just to package and sell it. In closing, let me say, commercial is a context, right? It's not a form. Um, it's and a vague fusion of names won't ever replace like the real knowledge of what the thing is, right? So whether you're in the studio, whether you're on a stage, whether in the street, whether in your video, whether you're in Broadway, or if you're in a movie, it's hip hop, right? It's not studio hip hop or Broadway hip hop. It's not stage hip hop. It's not studio hip hop. It's not movie hip hop. It's hip hop. When you look at any other form, it's not studio ballet or video ballet or commercial. It's ballet. No matter what the form is, you can't preface the form with a word like commercial because then that suggests that commercial is a thing. There is no technique commercial. You don't learn commercial technique or vocabulary as such, right? So you have to be really clear on what we're saying if we are not just if we're trying to really educate people so that they move forward and they keep things going and keep it alive with some integrity. This is all I'm really saying. So, like, let's honor the dance by naming it with respect, not the branding, right? So, that's it. That's the spill. I want to thank y'all for watching. Definitely hit the likes, hit the share, subscribe, and most importantly, stay grounded. Peace. What up, Hepsters? Lone CZ here, Intangible Roots, back with the second knowledge drop. And when people teach just these stylings as jazz without naming their creators, right? Without explaining their divergence from the authentic form, we're not just mislabeling, we're miseducating. If commercial jazz isn't a technique, because there is no commercial technique, there's no commercial vocabulary, there's no commercial form, right? This is just a label. So what is it? When we present jazz as a marketing tool, right, we water down what jazz really is, right? It erases the Black roots, we erase its rhythm, we erase the community that shaped it through celebration, through struggle, through spirit. And